A person can't help but notice that there are some people who don't seem to get moral judgments quite right. That is, they see some major moral issue in relationship to something that isn't significant. And vice versa, things that are significant, they just don't see it for some reason or another. I'll give you a couple of examples. Recently, there was a video clip that went viral, and it was of a maskless woman on a Delta flight attacking an 80-year-old man for eating without a mask. Now, mind you, she doesn't have her mask on either, but she's basically yelling at him, and then she turns around and starts slapping the guy, right? So she, basically physically accosts him. Now, there's a bit of a backstory to this. Her name is Patricia Cornwall. She's a former Baywatch actress, and she's also a Playboy model. So aside from the hypocrisy of slapping him because he isn't wearing a mask when she isn't wearing her mask, it doesn't give her the moral high ground giving her background. In other words, she is in no place to take the moral high ground with this 80-year-old because of the fact that she had because of her past and what she had actually done. I mean, this thing is public, being a Playboy model and the Baywatch actress when she's scantily clad is a public thing. And so she's not in any place morally to take the high ground. But that's where it's so interesting because of the fact that she attacked the guy based on what he was doing was wrong, when in point in fact what she had done was gravely wrong, and yet she thought she still had the moral high ground. Another one that I get as a priest from time to time, and you see this, I'm not sure quite what to make of it other than just people aren't thinking clearly, which is you will hear a mother say about the girlfriend of her son that she's a really good girl. And then you'll ask them, well, aren't they living together? Aren't they shacking up? Well, yeah, but she's a really good girl. Well, when you start probing it, what they mean by good is that she's nice. Well, nice is the minor thing. The major thing is they're committing fornication. That's a pretty big issue, and that does not make her a good girl. That makes her a bad girl, the fact that she's committing fornication. Another one is millennials. Now, I realize that millennials are an easy target. That's why I tend to poke at them. But in point in fact, you could say this about a lot of different kind of people other than just millennials. But these are the type of people that insist that others owe them a certain standard of living, even though they do not have a job, have no intention of getting a job, and even if they had a job, they would show up late, do a poor job, or don't do the job at all. And yet they still insist that they get paid this as a matter of justice, that people have to pay them this certain amount, Well, the fact is that the moral of that story is that here they don't even do their job, they show up late, which may be a minor thing, but or even if they don't do their job, which is somewhat can be a major thing. So what happens is that these other things that they don't see any problem with doing, and yet they're basically telling everybody that they've got to ante up so that they can have their standard of living. There's numerous stories, I can say this as a priest, there's numerous stories from priests who were called into their bishop's office because they did not enforce mask policies in their churches. And yet some parishioner, usually it's one of the lay women who's usually older, usually in the age range of about between 50 and 70, maybe a little bit older sometimes, but they will be the ones who will narc on the priest to the bishop and complain about it. They've even gone so far as even turning the priests, their own pastors, into the police. Now, some of you have heard me say this before, and I'll say it again. 5 years ago, I predicted if the lay people didn't stop abusing the Blessed Sacrament by receiving it in the state of mortal sin, that they were going to end up losing. They were not going to have regular access to the sacraments. Well, I was just unpacking that. I wasn't thinking in terms of whether this would become in the form of COVID or not, but there it is. But now I'm telling you, if you unpack what's happening now, because the major principle is if you attack something, if God gives you a gift and you attack it, then he takes it from you. Well, that means that coming up here sometime in the future, the lay people will not get regular access to priests because you can't keep attacking them and then not expect this to be a problem. But even in this case where the police come barging into Mass and stop the Mass, tells you that they have lost, even the police, and not all of them, because some are very fine, upstanding people, but some of the police have lost all sense of decorum. You know, the fact that that there might be a maskless person here or there, or that they got a report, you come in, you be quiet, you take a look at the situation, you assess it, and then because not wearing a mask is not, it's not like you're standing in there with a AK-47 mowing people down. Then you just let it go until the end of Mass. You pull the priest aside and you talk to him about it. But the fact that they would literally barge in, interrupt the Mass, etc., tells you that in their mind, religious matters are on a very, very low level in their mind. That in fact, their enforcing masks is actually more important than us speaking with God. They've lost a complete sense of decorum. People have lost, and they've lost their, they have a complete inability, but they've lost their ability to judge what is morally right and wrong. And yet, they'll hang other people on the slightest offense. Now, our Lord actually talked about this phenomenon. And this was, you see this in the Gospel of Matthew, it's 23:24 if you want to look it up. But he basically says to the Pharisees, blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. So these are the same kinds of people in the sense that, they'll be doing things that are morally wrong and they'll tolerate that and they think that's okay. But if somebody does even the slightest little thing off, then they just completely go after the person, right? And this is a sign that there is something wrong with their intellectual judgment about what's morally right and wrong. What exactly is this phenomenon which Christ himself described? Well, we have to back up just a bit. The natural law, as St. Thomas delineates it, has three categories, he says. In these three categories, the first category is that we are inclined to preserve our being as it is. Conservatio esse is the Latin phrase. So we can conserve our being as it is. And basically what this means is we don't like to get our fingers chopped off or something like that. We don't want to get killed, etc. So this is something that is a natural inclination. And so he says that in order for a person to get to the point where they lose these natural inclinations and become completely frustrated, they end up losing their use of reason. So we see this. So, for example, a guy who wants to go through a transgender operation to become a woman, this is an indication that he has lost the use of reason if he gets to that point where he actually thinks that he wants that. Okay. Then there is the second category of natural inclination, and this is the one in which we have in common with other animals. So, for example, eating, things of this sort, having children, raising the children, etc. Those are all second parts of the second category of natural inclination. So contraception, for example, is against the second category of natural inclination. It's technically speaking against all three, but that's the primary one that they tend to discuss. Then the last one is that which is proper to reason alone. And this is the natural inclination in which people have a recognition of what's morally right and wrong. So this is something that's proper. This natural inclination is that which is proper to reason alone. And so this is things like pursuit of the truth, understanding that God is to be obeyed, that there is to be government. Now, don't get me wrong, I think how much government we have is way too much. In fact, the principle of subsidiarity indicates that the government should basically be minimal. But that being said, we're inclined to actually have government, living community, etc. So these are the natural inclinations that we have. But part of this third category of natural inclination is the reality that God structured the human mind to be able to judge that certain things are morally right and wrong. And what do we mean by morally? Well, it's moral insofar as reason is able to recognize it. Our emotions don't see it. They don't act according to it necessarily. But it's something that reason is able to see that this is contrary to how we were designed, how we were structured, etc. So, for example, we know that we have a natural inclination to marriage, and that in that marriage there's a natural inclination to the permanency of the marriage, and that the people have an inclination to want to stay in that marriage until death. That's a natural inclination that we have. This is why if people commit adultery, it's contrary to that natural inclination, right? So reason in knowing that it's not right for human beings to commit adultery, as we know through the sixth commandment, that in a particular instance of adultery, if they were to judge it, they would say that this is morally wrong or irreprehensible, okay, or reprehensible, sorry. Okay, so that being said, then what this ultimately means then is that we have a natural inclination to judge that things are morally right according to the natural law, that is how we're designed. And this is also true in relationship to the divine positive law, because we know that God is to be obeyed. That's one of the natural inclinations that we have. St. Thomas mentions it in his earlier works when he's talking about the natural law. Okay, so that means the divine positive law, that is what God teaches us through revelation, we know is morally binding on us. So this means that we recognize that we must follow the natural law, and reason is able to recognize that natural law. And we know this too, because when people steal from us, we know that's not right, right? And you don't even have to necessarily teach a child that much about it. They just know when someone takes something from them, there's something wrong with that, right? Okay, so even though it might be not perfectly formed. So St. Thomas then goes on to say that the natural law can become occluded, that is clouded, by two things, sin or bad formation. How does sin do it? Sin, so this inclination that God built into our intellect to be able to judge that things are morally right and wrong, this structure that he put in our mind, can become occluded by sin. How does that happen? Very simple. So when the intellect judges that something's morally right or wrong, it presents that to the will for choice. Are we going to do this or not? Are you going to steal this thing or not? Okay. So then what happens is if the will wants to steal it, then what it'll do is it can't will evil per se, St. Thomas says. It can only will the evil under the aspect of the good, because ultimately the will can only choose the good. So it's either a real good, such as, no, don't steal, or I'm going to do the right thing by my parents, I'm going to honor them, or it's the wrong thing. And so he said, in the wrong thing, though, what has to happen is the will has to move the intellect. So remember, the intellect judged that this thing was morally wrong, according to the natural law, and according to its formation. Then the will moves the intellect to ignore the fact that it's morally wrong. Because we do this all the time. When we commit sin, we just kind of ignore the fact that it's, that God said don't do this or don't do that, and so we just, ignore that part because we're focusing on what? The good that we're going to get out of it. And so we're looking at this thing under the aspect of the apparent good, he says. But because the will moves the intellect to judge, that moves the intellect to judge this thing in a way that's contrary to the way the intellect knows to be the truth. That is, I know this thing's sinful, but I'm going to ignore it and act like it's not sinful, think about it like it's not sinful, and I'm going to just focus on the good thing I'm getting out of it. That's contrary to the way the intellect was designed. In other words, it's contrary to its nature. It's contrary to its natural inclinations. And that's called violence. The definition of violence is action contrary to the nature of a thing. Whenever that happens, the principal effect of violence is you weaken the thing that suffers the violence. And so in this particular case, the intellect becomes weakened because it leaves in the intellect an initial habit that if a person keeps choosing it, it starts to ingrain that habit so that in the future, when he goes to judge whether that thing is morally right and wrong, his intellect's going to act according to its intellectual habits and actually judge that this thing is okay. I'm going to give you an example of how this process actually occurred historically. In the 40s, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, not so much the 20s because that was the roaring 20s, but in the 30s and 40s, most of our grandparents knew absolutely that sex before marriage was absolutely verboten. You didn't do it, and it was a matter of honor. You treated the woman with respect, etc. Okay. Then the Second World War hits, and the guys coming back from the Second World War, the morals had collapsed. So in the 50s, What happened is the, quote, greatest generation, unquote. A lot of fornication started to happen behind the scenes. It was quiet because there was still this veneer in the culture that this was not appropriate or acceptable. And so people would still do it, but they were still doing it behind the scenes. And how do we know that? Because in the 60s, they didn't really stop their children from doing it because they had done it. So then by the 60s, you get the free love movement. This stuff gets out in the open. Fornication gets out into the open. Then it gets to the point where people don't think there's anything wrong with it as long as you love the individual. And now it's gotten to the point where the conventional wisdom states that really, before you get married, you should live together. In other words, you should commit fornication to see if it's going to really work out or not. Which, putting aside the statistics that most of the people do that end up in divorce, more so, I should say, than those who are chaste before marriage. But that being said, that's the sign of the intellectual progression, right? They give in to it in the 50s, and then by the time you get to the 60s, well, we're not going to do anything about it. We're not going to stop. And then by the time you get to the 70s and 80s, it's if you love the person, it's okay. And now it's actually, no, you should do it. So that's a change in the intellectual formation that's actually occurred. But this is a sign that because of the sin in our culture, it's progressed this way. Okay. So sin can actually occlude people's judgment and get them to actually not be able to judge that the moral right things or that morally bad things are actually morally bad. And also, if they're weak and they continue to choose not to do the right thing over the course of time, intellectually they're going to judge, don't do this, and eventually that's how they're going to see it intellectually. And so they're going to get to the point where they're going to think, you really shouldn't do these things, right? And so they'll start judging the wrong things. This is the intellectual progression. This is how psychologically it works. That eventually, either through sin, and we'll talk about the bad formation here in a minute, then what happens is intellectually, people get to the point where they judge the wrong things as being morally right, and the morally right things as being morally wrong. And that also means that these things become exaggerated, especially because their emotional life is out of control. One of the things that St. Thomas talks about, which I talk about in my book in Psychology, is that the emotions precipitate our judgment. They affect our judgment. They tend to drag us to thinking that a thing's worse than it is or better than it actually is because of our emotions, and that's what we're experiencing. And so what happens is you couple that bad intellectual formation, those malformed consciences, with a bunch of emotions, and what you're going to get is, a woman in her 50s slapping a 50-year-old man around on an airplane for not wearing a mask. That's what's going to happen. The other one is bad intellectual formation, St. Thomas says. And this occurs, we see it right in our own public education. They're being taught all sorts of things about the LGBTQ alphabet stuff, about this is right, this is what you have to do this, which is again malforming the child, and so their judgments are getting their judgment is getting affected, the natural inclination in them is getting occluded, and then at the same time they're hyping certain things that just don't even exist, or that are not as bad as everybody wants to make them out to be. And so there's this malformation that's actually happening. They're literally warping people's consciences, so that now what's happened is we're living in a culture when people have gone through this communist / deep state / progressive / free thought, etc., in the education system. Well, now we've got people who can't tell moral right from wrong. Their moral compass is completely off. In fact, it's 180 degrees, and strongly so. So, and it's even getting bad even within the church. We are told, for example, that when it comes to the sin of Sodom, that we're not supposed to judge those people. Who am I to judge? In regard to the homosexuals and their activity. In fact, right now you actually even have some saying that it's a good thing, that homosexual relationships have certain good things about them. And this is just absolutely contrary to the truth. The church has always indicated that these things are sins, as St. Thomas says, contra naturam. These are contrary to nature, and that they're so disordered, they even call them sometimes the graviora delicta, that is, the more graver sins and disordered sins. We also know it's a sin crying to heaven for vengeance. Even St. Catherine of Siena said, or maybe it was Teresa of Avila, can't remember which, But they said that even the demons find it revulsive. So the fact is that now that they've gotten to that point where they actually think this thing is good, that's a sign that people's intellectual judgment is completely off about what's morally right and wrong. The natural law is occluded. And that's a sign of mental illness, frankly. But we're told so we're not to judge. But then we're also turned around, right around. So this major thing is, oh, that's not a big deal. In fact, it's okay. It's good, actually. But then we're told right around and say, you have to be worrying about your carbon footprint. You have to be worrying. Everybody has to be doing their thing for the environment. Okay, well, look at. We all have an obligation, according to our state in life, to take reasonable care of the environment. But it's not because of the environment. It's for the other people in the environment. It's a matter of justice to them. And it's also a matter of appreciating God, the glory of God and the magnificence of his creation. Okay, we all get that. But to sit there and say that driving down the street in my car is somehow morally sinful, but or if I'm driving too big of a car, that somehow that's sinful, but it's okay for the guys to commit sodomy. Again, there's just a complete disconnect. And this is going on right now, even in the church. So, and then in the Old Testament, we see that human beings have this trajectory. Unless God gives people the grace to see it, or unless there's some moral authority that says, no, this you have to do this or you have to do that. If people stop listening to that moral authority, then that's when the problems sit in. We saw this in the Old Testament. What happens? God leaves them kind of to their devices. By the time you get to the flood, we've got gargantuan problems. But at a certain point, God actually has to step in, appear to Moses, and say, here, this is what is morally right and wrong. Here's the Ten Commandments. And what the Ten Commandments, St. Thomas says, are actually just an explication of the natural law. In fact, in the Summa Contra Gentiles, he actually argues to all of the Ten Commandments based purely on the natural light of reason without any appeal to revelation. So we can know this. We know that that's the structure that he put into our minds, into the natural law. But because of original sin, the defects of original sin, the darkness of judgment, etc., or the darkness of the intellect, this is going to lead to people just moral compasses going off, which we saw historically. This is why God ends up with the flood. He wipes humanity out because they're so sinful. And it's because of the fact that their moral judgment has just imploded. This is also why he had to finally come and tell Moses, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. He even had to do it in relationship to matters of religion. He had to tell people, this is precisely how you're going to worship me. Because why? Because our intellects are so occluded and our emotions are so involved in that kind of stuff that if God doesn't tell us exactly how to do it, we're just going to get it wrong. And we're seeing that even in the church right now. Then, to top it off, Christ told us in the New Testament, these are the things that are still binding in relationship to the Old Testament. These are the things that aren't. So you can eat pork, but you can't go and you still have to follow the Ten Commandments. Plus, then he also gave us parts of the divine positive law, like love your neighbor as yourself. So these are things that he gave command, and so God had to come in and tell us precisely what to do. Well, where is this information that God told us about ourselves? Because he's basically just revealing to us this is what you're designed to do in the natural law. That's what he basically told Moses, if we boil it down to it. So where is that? Well, that moral code is in the tradition of the church. That's why the church has to have a magisterium. They have to have a moral authority that teaches us what God has already told us, what the saints have already said, what the church has always taught, as St. Vincent Lorenz says, everywhere and in all cases and for all. Okay, so you have to follow that moral tradition, because that's going to keep the clarity about our judgment. It's going to give precision to our judgment about what's morally right and wrong. It's going to perfect this natural law inclination to judge what's morally right and wrong. But this is the real difficulty. People, and this is the moral to this whole story. God designed us with a natural inclination to judge things as being morally right and wrong. These people who are completely out in left field, who are completely off the rails, who are telling us that these things are sinful, which aren't, and these things which aren't sinful, which are, then we know that they're just, they're not. This does not size up to what the church has always taught us. This doesn't size up to what God has told us. This doesn't even size up to right reason. That is what reason can know through the natural law. Okay, we see that. But the fact that they've gone off the rails and their conscience are malformed doesn't mean they still don't have the natural inclination to want to judge that things are right and wrong. Even though their judgment is bad and their consciences are malformed, it doesn't mean that they still don't have that inclination. And that's why we have all these Karens, as they call them. That's why we have all these people that are straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel, as I mentioned. So in all these cases, we all come across it in our own lives, where we have people who are fussing over the most minor of things and making a big tuda over something that's not even there, and yet at the main, and that in their own lives, there's gargantuan sin. We just have to make sure ourselves that we don't fall into that or get sucked into that, and that in the end, we always follow the natural law, the divine positive law, so that the natural inclinations in us can find fulfillment. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.